The millionaire's son woke up every night, screaming in mysterious pain that no doctor could diagnose. Tests, specialists, expensive treatments, nothing worked. The father, a powerful man used to having control over everything, was desperate. Hope seemed lost until a simple housekeeper, a quiet and observant woman, started working at the mansion. One night, the boy's screams echoed louder than usual. The father ran to the room, expecting to find his son in agony. But the scene he encountered was not one of pain. It was something that made him panic completely, something that defied logic and revealed the terrible truth behind his son's suffering. The scream cut through the silence of the mansion like a shard of glass tearing through the finest silk. Arthur Sterling, the man whose name made Wall Street tremble and whose deals moved millions of dollars every hour, shrank in his Italian leather armchair. There, in his lavish office, surrounded by stock charts and profit reports, he was the very picture of power, a financial giant whose net worth was a subject of speculation in Forbes. But in that instant, with the sharp echo of his 8-year-old son's pain piercing the walls, he was nothing. He was a small, fragile man, broken by an impotence that no amount of money could cure. Every night, the same torture. Little Theo, his only heir, the center of his universe, was haunted by an agony that began with the precision of a macabre clock and stretched into the early morning. The most renowned doctors in the country, whose consultations cost a small fortune, had paraded through the house. They ran every test, used the most advanced technology, but the diagnosis was always vague and frustrating. "It's psychosomatic," a famous neurologist said, with the air of one who had unraveled a great mystery. A phantom pain, a manifestation of grief from the loss of his mother. Arthur invested in therapies, alternative treatments, and experimental medications, but nothing silenced the screams. His son was wasting away, becoming a pale, frightened shadow of the vibrant boy he once was. Amid the chaos, the governess, Agatha, was his rock. A middle-aged woman, efficient and with a rigid posture, she cared for Theo with a devotion that bordered on superhuman. She organized his medications, prepared his ultra-healthy meals, and was the only one who could sometimes calm the boy's sobs with her firm presence. Arthur trusted her blindly, entrusting her with the care of his most precious asset, while he tried to keep his empire standing. However, the mansion was vast, a steel and glass giant that required constant upkeep. It was for this reason that, to help with the cleaning of the East Wing, a simple housekeeper was hired. Her name was Lucy. She arrived without fanfare, a woman of modest appearance, quiet, with a deep gaze that seemed to see through appearances, beyond the wealth and luxury that surrounded her. The contrast between her and Agatha was stark. While the governess was a hurricane of efficiency, Lucy moved with a serene calm, a silent observer in the grand theater of that house. Arthur noticed something peculiar. Theo, who recoiled from the touch of doctors and barely responded to Agatha's attempts at conversation, seemed different near the new employee. He didn't pull away when she entered his room to clean. Lucy didn't try to force an interaction. She simply hummed soft old folk tunes as she dusted the furniture, and the sound seemed to fill the room with a peace that had long been absent. One afternoon, Arthur was standing in the hallway, hidden by the shadow of a marble column, when he saw something that made his heart stop for a second. Lucy was turned away, cleaning the large window in Theo's room. The boy, sitting on his bed, was watching her, and then a tiny, almost imperceptible smile curved his son's lips. It was a fleeting glimpse of light in the profound darkness they lived in, a flicker of hope so fragile and unexpected that Arthur held his breath, fearing the slightest movement might extinguish it. Theo's fleeting smile became the only investment Arthur Sterling truly cared about. He, who analyzed the profitability of stocks and the cash flow of billion-dollar companies with surgical precision, now dedicated his mind to deciphering the value of that small gesture. In the days that followed, he began to observe Lucy, not as a boss watching an employee, but as a man adrift who spots a distant lighthouse. She did nothing extraordinary. She continued her work with the same discretion, the same serenity, but her presence was like a balm. When she was in the room, Theo's silence seemed less fraught with fear and closer to tranquility. Arthur started to notice the stark contrast with Agatha's routine. The governess was the personification of efficiency, but everything about her movements was rigid, calculated. Theo's diet was a case in point. Visually perfect dishes with all the recommended nutrients, which the boy barely touched, pushing the food around with his fork under Agatha's disapproving gaze. "It's for your own good, Theo. Your father spends a great deal of money to give you the best," she would say, her voice firm, leaving no room for objection. And then, every night, came the ritual of the vitamin supplement. Agatha would prepare it in the kitchen, a thick, amber-colored liquid served in a specific glass. She would take it to the room and supervise Theo to ensure he drank every last drop. Arthur, in his ignorance and desperation, saw this as an act of extreme care. Lucy, however, saw it with different eyes that were not deceived by the appearance of discipline. They were the eyes of a mother and a granddaughter who had learned to read between the lines of human behavior. Silently cleaning the hallways or the boys' room, she noticed the pattern. Theo's piercing pain, the screams that echoed through the house, never began immediately. There was a delay, an interval of almost an hour. Precisely the amount of time that passed after he drank the amber liquid from Agatha's hands. The macabre gearing of that routine became painfully clear to her. The glass, the weight, the scream. It was a precise clock, marking the arrival of pain. At the same time, she noted the boy's growing pallor, the deep, dark circles that stained his childlike face. Despite the governess's insistence on a diet she called revitalizing, Theo seemed weaker, more lifeless with each passing day. Concern grew in Lucy's heart, a silent anguish that kept her from sleeping. She was just a housekeeper. Who was she to question the trusted right hand of a multimillionaire, a governess praised by all the doctors? Losing this job would be a disaster for her family. But then her eyes would meet Theo's, large and frightened, and the fear of losing her job became small next to the fear she saw in that child. One Thursday afternoon, while polishing silverware in the pantry, she heard Agatha's sharp voice from the garden. "Theo, stop fussing. You need to get some sunshine." Lucy peeked through the window and saw the boy huddled on a bench, shivering despite the mild warmth. In that moment, a decision formed in her mind. It was a seed of courage, watered by compassion. Later that day, she found Arthur in the main hall. He looked like a ghost haunting his own castle, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. His shoulders, which carried the weight of a vast financial empire, were slumped. Lucy took a deep breath, her heart pounding. With respectful shyness, she approached him. "Sir, forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "But the chamomile tea my grandmother used to make always soothed my son's stomach aches. Perhaps it could help young Theo." Lucy's words hung in the air. A breath of simplicity in a world of complexity and failure. For a moment, Arthur clung to them. Chamomile, a solution so earthly, so distant from the sterile labs and expensive diagnoses that had become his reality. It was the voice of ancestral wisdom, an echo of a time when healing didn't come in patented vials. He was about to thank her, perhaps even ask her to prepare the tea, when a third voice, sharp as ice, cut through the atmosphere. "What is this nonsense?" Agatha appeared in the hallway, her posture impeccable, her face a mask of controlled indignation. She had overheard the conversation, and her eyes shot daggers at Lucy with a contempt that would freeze anyone. Arthur felt a chill. The small flame of hope instantly extinguished. "What do you think you're doing?" Agatha continued, addressing Lucy but with the corner of her eye fixed on Arthur, as if reprimanding him for even listening. With all due respect, ma'am, your place is with the cleaning supplies. Master Theo's health is a matter for specialists. Lucy shrank back, her face flushing with humiliation. I just wanted to help, she murmured, her voice weak. Help? Agatha scoffed, with a short, humorless laugh. Your ignorance is dangerous. Do you think a bit of Grandma's tea can solve what the best doctors in the country can't? Mr. Sterling spends a fortune, an immense capital on treatments, and you come with old wives' tales. The phrase old wives' tales was delivered with a special venom designed to demean Lucy and at the same time validate the scientific approach she supervised. Arthur felt cornered. Agatha's logic, as cruel as it was, echoed his own desperate line of thinking. He had bet everything on medicine, on his financial assets to buy a solution. To admit that a simple tea might work would be to admit the failure of all his power, all his wealth. Ashamed by the scene, by the public humiliation of a woman who only wished his son well, and ashamed of his own weakness, he yielded. Agatha is right, Lucy. I appreciate the thought, but let's leave this to the professionals, he said, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. Lucy just nodded, her eyes welling with tears. Without another word, she turned and retreated, leaving behind a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Arthur couldn't look at Agatha. He muttered an excuse and took refuge in his office, the bitter taste of shame in his mouth. The seed, however, had been planted. For the rest of the afternoon, he tried to focus on his investment reports, on the rise and fall of stocks, on the soaring value of his crypto portfolio, but his mind refused to focus. The image of Lucy, with her humble suggestion and sincere gaze, superimposed itself over the profit charts. And in contrast, the image of Agatha, with her controlled fury and cutting disdain, disturbed him in a way he couldn't name. Night fell, bringing with it the customary wave of dread. He heard Agatha's footsteps in the hall, firm and rhythmic, carrying the nightly supplement. He heard the door to Theo's room close, and then he waited. The silence of the mansion seemed denser, more oppressive than ever. He looked at the gold clock on his desk, a gift he'd given himself when his net worth hit its first billion. The hands moved with torturous slowness, and then, right on schedule, the scream came. Sharp, desperate, tearing through the night, but this time something was different in Arthur's reaction. Instead of the blind, desperate rush to his son's room, he was paralyzed. His eyes were fixed on the clock. He remembered the time he heard Agatha's footsteps, 57 minutes. Lucy's observation wasn't about the tea, it was about the time. The pain always started about an hour later, always. The coincidence was too brutal, too precise to be a coincidence. For the first time, a terrible, dark and venomous doubt began to form in the back of his mind, a suspicion he dared not name, but which sent an icy chill down his spine. The doubt, once planted, acted like a slow poison, spreading through Arthur's veins and clouding his perception of reality. He remained in his office for a long time, Theo's scream diminishing to a pained cry that distance transformed into a ghostly wail. The gold clock on his desk, once a symbol of his fortune and success, now seemed to mock him, each tick marking a minute of his son's agony, an agony that was timed and terrifyingly predictable. His mind, trained to analyze patterns in the stock market and anticipate moves in international business, replayed the scene with Agatha and Lucy incessantly. Agatha's reaction hadn't just been protective, it had been viscerally hostile. The humiliation she inflicted on Lucy was disproportionate, almost savage. Why? Why would a suggestion as harmless as chamomile tea provoke such fury? Arthur tried to rationalize. Agatha was under immense pressure. She was devoted to Theo. Perhaps she saw Lucy's suggestion as a criticism of her work, a veiled accusation that she wasn't doing enough. Yes, that must be it. The stress, the exhaustion, the frustration of seeing Theo suffer night after night. It was understandable, but logic, the foundation of his entire empire and vast net worth, couldn't silence the intuition screaming in his chest, the precision of the timing, almost an hour, always. It was too clear a pattern to be a coincidence. The next morning, he went down for breakfast, determined to observe. He would act normally, but his senses would be on high alert. Agatha was already in the dining room, serving a portion of fruit for Theo, who barely glanced at it. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she said with her usual efficiency. "We had a difficult night. The pain seems to be getting worse. Perhaps we should call Dr. Evans again." The words were of concern, but the tone was factual, as if she were presenting a loss report on a low-yield investment. Arthur looked at his son. Theo's skin was almost translucent, and his eyes, once so bright, were dull and sunken. A wave of anger and guilt washed over him. Guilt for his absence, for having delegated the most important care in his life. Anger at his impotence, at all his money being useless. "Perhaps we should try something different," Arthur said, his voice carefully neutral. "Something less aggressive." Agatha's gaze hardened for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible change. "With all due respect, sir, we have tried everything. Dr. Evans's approach is the most recommended. Changing course now would be reckless. We need consistency." She spoke like an investment fund manager, advising against panic-selling assets. Her logic was, as always, impeccable on the surface. But underneath, Arthur felt a current of control, an unyielding insistence that made him uncomfortable. During the day, he forced himself to work, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Lucy, of her quiet kindness, of the smile she had managed to draw from Theo. He thought of Agatha's fury. The two images clashed in his head, creating an unbearable dissonance. Night arrived again, bringing with it the same shroud of dread. He knew what would happen. The routine would repeat itself. Agatha would prepare the supplement, Theo would drink it, and an hour later, the screams would begin. But this time, Arthur wouldn't stay in his office, a prisoner of his own wealth and pain. He would not be a passive listener. The doubt was a torture worse than the harshest truth. He needed to know. He needed to see with his own eyes. The scream came, punctual as ever. It tore through the quiet of the night, but this time it didn't paralyze Arthur. On the contrary, it was a trigger. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mixture of fear for his son and a cold terror of what he might discover. He walked out of his office, his steps silent on the Persian rug. The hallway leading to Theo's room had never seemed so long, so dark. Each step was a battle against the urge to retreat, to return to comfortable denial. He reached the bedroom door, which was ajar. The dim light from the bedside lamp spilled onto the floor. He heard Agatha's voice inside, but it wasn't the soothing voice she used in his presence. It was something different, something that made Arthur's blood run cold. He moved closer to the crack, his heart in his throat, and peered inside. The scene that revealed itself through the crack in the door made Arthur's world collapse. It wasn't a noisy breakdown, but a silent, devastating implosion that stole the air from his lungs. Agatha was not calming Theo. She was not rocking him or whispering words of comfort. She was standing beside the bed, her rigid silhouette against the soft light of the lamp. Her face, which to Arthur had always been a mask of competence and dedication, was twisted into a cold fury, an expression of cruelty so pure he didn't recognize it. In her hand, she held the empty supplement glass, brandishing it like a weapon. Theo was huddled on the bed, his small hands covering his face, his body trembling with sobs of pure terror. The pain Arthur heard every night wasn't just physical, it was something infinitely worse. And then he heard the words, hissed with a venom that pierced his heart. "Drink it all now," she said, her voice low and menacing. "Your father is tired of you. He can't stand your whining anymore. If you don't get better, he'll send you away. just like your mother left. The cruel lie, the perverse manipulation, hit Arthur with physical force. His late wife, her memory, used as a tool of torture against their own son. In that instant, the fog of pain, helplessness, and grief that had enveloped him for months dissipated like smoke, replaced by a terrible, icy clarity. It all made sense. Theo's fear of her, her fanatical insistence on the routine, her violent reaction to Lucy's simple suggestion. It wasn't zeal, it was control, it was a siege. Agatha wasn't caring for his son. She was breaking him, piece by piece. He, the billionaire who had built an empire from nothing, who prided himself on his ability to read people and anticipate market moves, had been blind. He had let a monster into his home, his sanctuary, and handed her the key to his son's soul. The first reaction was a primal urge to burst through the door, to tear Agatha away from Theo, to protect his child. But something stopped him. The strategist within him, the man who had built his fortune on patience and calculation, took over. A confrontation now would be his word against hers. She would play the victim, the dedicated, misunderstood governess. She could twist the story, use his grief against him. He couldn't risk it, not with Theo's emotional life at stake. He needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would unmask the farce she had so carefully constructed. He backed away from the door, one step at a time, his heart hammering a ragged rhythm in his chest. The sound of Theo's sobs was a knife twisting in his gut, but he forced himself to move away. Each step away from that room was an act of superhuman discipline. Who could he trust? His lawyers, his security team. They all saw Agatha as the perfect governess. Her image was solidly built. Then a face came to his mind, a quiet face, with eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. Lucy. The woman Agatha had humiliated, the woman who noticed the pattern, who offered the simplest solution and was rebuffed with fury. She was the one. She was the only one who, without knowing it, had already seen a piece of the puzzle. With a new and terrible determination, Arthur moved through the shadows of his own house. He was no longer the master of the mansion. He was an intruder in enemy territory. He had to find Lucy that very night, without Agatha knowing. He went down the service staircase, a path he rarely used, the cold marble under his expensive shoes feeling foreign, hostile. He needed to get to the staff wing, a labyrinth of corridors he barely knew. But how could he do it without raising suspicion? The house had cameras, and Agatha, he now understood, had control over everything. The mansion, once the ultimate symbol of his success and net worth, had become a gilded cage. Every hallway seemed to have eyes, every shadow a threat. Arthur knew that Agatha, with her obsession for control, likely monitored the main security cameras. He needed a plan, a strategy to reach Lucy undetected. His mind, accustomed to mapping complex routes for moving capital and closing deals, now focused on navigating his own home. He remembered an old blueprint of the estate, kept in his office safe alongside deeds and stock certificates. Silently, he returned to his sanctuary, locked the door, and opened the safe. There, among documents worth millions of dollars, he unrolled the mansion's design. His eyes scanned the lines, ignoring ballrooms and indoor pools, focusing on service corridors, hidden staircases, the routes the staff used and that he, in his arrogance, had never bothered to learn. There was a passage, used for laundry transport, that connected the East Wing, where Lucy slept, directly to the basement of the West Wing, not far from his office. It was a blind spot for most of the cameras. It was risky, but it was his only chance. With the blueprint mentally mapped, he left the office and headed for the laundry room. The air was heavy with the smell of detergent and the humidity from the machines. He found the discreet door leading to the passage. It was narrow and poorly lit, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. As he moved through the tight corridor, He felt the weight of his failure as a father. He had built a castle for his son, but had failed to ensure it was a safe home. He had filled the family vault with gold and assets, but had left his son's soul unprotected. He found Lucy's small room at the end of a simple hallway. He knocked softly on the door, the muffled sound like thunder to his anxious heart. The door opened a few inches, and Lucy's startled eyes met his. Seeing him there, at this hour, in this place, was beyond any reality. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, confusion and fear plain in her voice. "May I come in? We need to talk. It's urgent, and no one can know," he said, his voice low and tense. She hesitated for a second, then opened the door completely. The room was small, simple, but impeccably neat. There was a photo of a smiling boy on her nightstand. With a voice choked with emotion and urgency, Arthur told her what he had seen. He spared no detail, the cruelty in Agatha's words, the terror on Theo's face. As he spoke, he saw the confusion in Lucy's eyes turn to horror and then to a deep compassion that disarmed him. She didn't judge him for his blindness. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just listened, her face contorted in pain for the child she barely knew, but for whom she already felt an immense affection. When he finished, the silence in the small room was heavy. "I knew it," Lucy said, her voice firm but full of sadness. "I knew something was wrong. The way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching, the way his pain always followed the same routine." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't alone in his suspicion, and now he wasn't alone in his certainty. "I need proof, Lucy. Concrete proof. I can't just confront her. She'll deny everything. She'll make me look like a madman," he said, desperation seeping into his voice. Together, in that small room, far from the luxury and power, the billionaire and the housekeeper began to devise a plan. The initial idea was Arthur's, born from his experience with corporate espionage. Install hidden cameras. But Lucy, with her practical wisdom, shook her head. "She's clever, sir. She cleans that room every day. She would notice anything out of place. We need something she can't see, something she delivers to us herself." And that's when the simplicity of the plan revealed itself, as brilliant as the suggestion of chamomile tea. The focus shouldn't be on the verbal threats, but on the supplement, the glass. The proof had to be in the liquid she gave Theo every night. "Tomorrow night," Arthur said, his mind already working on the logistics, "while Agatha is busy with dinner, we need to switch the glass." Lucy nodded. "I can create a distraction in the kitchen, a small accident, something to call her away for a few minutes. And I'll go into Theo's room before she does," Arthur finished. "I'll take the glass she prepared and swap it for an identical one with something else inside, something that won't hurt him." "Grape juice," Lucy suggested. "It's the same color." The plan was risky. The margin for error was razor thin. If Agatha discovered them, the consequences would be unpredictable. She could hurt Theo, she could flee, she could destroy any chance they had of exposing her. But it was their only chance, the only way to bring the proof out of the shadows and into the light. The following night descended upon the mansion not as a cloak of peace, but as a veil of conspiracy. The air was thick, heavy with the secret shared between Arthur and Lucy. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified, heralding the act to come. In his office, Arthur held the duplicate glass, filled with grape juice. The glass was cold in his trembling hand. He, a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions with glacial calm, who watched the fluctuation of his stocks with the detachment of a general at a war map, felt his heart pound uncontrollably. No investment, no high-stakes gamble, no closed deal compared to this night's operation. The capital at stake wasn't measured in dollars or Bitcoin. It was measured in the life and sanity of his son. He exchanged a look with Lucy as she passed the hallway on her way to the kitchen. It was an almost imperceptible nod, a silent communication that sealed their pact. She was terrified, he could see, but there was a steely determination in her eyes that strengthened him. The hour approached. Arthur heard Agatha's measured steps heading to the kitchen to prepare the nightly ritual. It was the beginning of the final act. He positioned himself in a blind spot in the corridor, the glass hidden beneath his jacket. A few minutes later, a sharp, crashing sound echoed from the kitchen, the clang of a metal tray hitting the marble floor, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Arthur's heart leaped. Lucy had played her part. Immediately, Agatha's irritated voice cut through the air. "You clumsy fool! Look what you've done! Incompetent!" The humiliation was public and cruel, but it was the sound of opportunity. Knowing Agatha would be distracted for precious minutes, Arthur moved. He slid down the hall like a shadow, adrenaline sharpening his every sense. He entered Theo's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, his wide, anxious eyes fixed on the door. On the nightstand, the target, the glass with the amber liquid, gleaming maliciously under the lamplight. "Dad?" Theo whispered, his voice fragile. Arthur put a finger to his lips. "It's going to be okay, son. Trust me," he murmured, his voice hoarse with tension. In a swift, precise movement, he snatched Agatha's glass and replaced it with the one containing juice. The swap took less than 3 seconds. He concealed the original glass under his jacket, the liquid feeling like it was burning through the fabric. He gave his son a quick kiss on the forehead and retreated into the hall, disappearing into the shadows just an instant before he heard Agatha's hurried footsteps approaching. He hid in a dark alcove, holding his breath. Agatha entered the room, muttering about the uselessness of certain employees. She picked up the glass from the nightstand and, with her usual coldness, supervised as Theo drank it all. Arthur watched, his heart hammering, as his son drank the harmless grape juice. Agatha took the empty glass and left, noticing nothing. The first part of the plan was complete. Arthur waited until her footsteps faded away and then looked at what he held in his hand. There, in that glass, was the truth. That liquid was the most important asset in his entire vast portfolio. It was the key, the proof that would dismantle Agatha's castle of lies and set his son free. He couldn't wait until morning. He couldn't risk the sample being discovered or compromised. He silently made his way to the garage. He took out his cell phone and dialed a number he didn't use often, the contact for a private security and investigations firm that prized discretion above all else. "I need a full toxicology screening," he said, his voice low and urgent as soon as the call was answered. "Now, secrecy is absolute. Meet me at your partner lab in 1 hour." He hung up before there could be any questions. With the glass carefully packed in a small cooler he kept in the car, he opened the garage door electronically and slipped into the dark night, carrying the evidence that could confirm his worst fears and change his life forever. The city at night was a blur of neon lights and hurried shadows. For Arthur, driving his luxury sedan, the outside world seemed distant, unreal. The only reality was contained in the cooler on the passenger seat. Every red light was torture, every intersection an obstacle between him and the truth. His mind, normally a constant flow of business strategies and dividend analysis, was stuck in a loop of horror and anticipation. What would the liquid reveal? He braced for the worst, but a small, desperate part of him still prayed this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps it was just some strange, aggressive herbal supplement. Perhaps he was wrong about Agatha. This fragile hope was the last barrier against the awful conclusion his intuition had already reached. The lab was in an anonymous building on a quiet street, a place designed for wealthy clients who needed answers without questions. A tired-looking technician was waiting for him at the door, alerted by the security firm. Arthur handed over the cooler. "I need this rushed. Cost is not an issue," he said, The words he used to fast-track deals sounding alien in this context. The technician just nodded and disappeared through a door with the sample. Arthur was left in a small, sterile, silent waiting room. The silence was worse than Theo's screams. In that vacuum, his thoughts ran wild. He thought of his late wife, of how she had trusted him to protect their family. He had failed. He had sunk so deep into building an empire of assets that he had neglected his one true treasure. The wealth he had accumulated seemed like a sick joke, a mountain of paper and numbers that couldn't buy his son peace or safety. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Lucy was living her own version of torture. After Arthur left, she finished her work and retreated to her room, but sleep was impossible. She prayed, her hands clasped tightly, for Mr. Sterling to return safely and for the truth to come out. She thought of Theo, alone in that immense house with that woman. Even knowing he had only drunk juice, her fear for him was a physical presence in her small room. She felt like an accomplice, a co-conspirator in a dangerous plot, but the image of the boy's terrified face gave her strength. She was doing the right thing, and for the first time in that house, she felt she was not just a housekeeper, she was a protector. The hours crawled by in the lab's waiting room. Arthur paced back and forth, the worn grey carpet mapping the path of his anxiety. He considered calling the mansion to speak with Lucy, but decided against it, fearing Agatha might somehow intercept the call. He was utterly isolated, alone with his demons. Finally, the door opened. The technician returned, his face impassive, holding a single sheet of paper. He didn't have to say a word. The lack of any emotion on his face was a sentence in itself. "The preliminary results are in, sir," the man said, extending the report. Arthur took the paper, his hands sweating. His eyes scanned the technical jargon, the chemical formulas, searching for words he could understand, and then he found them. The words that confirmed the evil and shattered the last particle of hope he had left. Phenolphthalein, senna extract. Compounds found in powerful laxatives, known to cause severe abdominal cramping, dehydration, and intense pain, and mixed with them, an extract from a plant that, in continuous doses, induced muscle spasms and an internal burning sensation. It wasn't a supplement, it was a poison, a potion carefully crafted not to kill, but to torture, to create a chronic, inexplicable illness, to generate absolute dependence on the caregiver who was supposedly fighting day and night to alleviate the very pain she was inflicting. The paper trembled in his hand. A wave of cold, all-consuming rage surged through his body, so powerful it left him breathless. Agatha wasn't trying to heal his son. She was poisoning him, slowly, methodically, night after night. The goal was clear and monstrous, to make herself the indispensable hero in the life of a desperate millionaire father, securing her job, her power, and her place of influence within the house. His son's pain wasn't psychosomatic. It was real, physical, and deliberately inflicted by the woman he had trusted most in the world. The drive home was a journey through a dark tunnel of rage and clarity. The city lights, once a blur, were now sharp, almost painfully bright. Every detail of the world around him seemed heightened, as if the revelation had torn a veil from his eyes. The lab report lay on the seat beside him, a single sheet of paper that weighed more than all the gold bars in his vault. It wasn't just a document, it was a declaration of war. When he reached the mansion, the grandeur of the stone and glass facade disgusted him. It looked like a mausoleum, a monument to his own negligence. He entered silently, using the service key to avoid the main hall. His first instinct was to run upstairs, drag Agatha from the guest room where she slept, and confront her with the raw, ugly truth. But the same discipline that had stopped him from bursting into Theo's room the night before held him back now. An explosion of rage would give her the chance to play the victim, to create a scene, perhaps even to try something against herself to generate sympathy. No, The climax would not be loud and chaotic. It would be silent, surgical, and devastating. He needed Lucy. She was his only ally in this enemy territory. He retraced his steps through the service passage, his heart now beating with a cold, determined rhythm. He knocked on Lucy's door again. When she opened it, the relief on her face at seeing him was immediately replaced by concern at his dark expression. "What happened, sir?" she asked, her voice tense. Without a word, Arthur handed her the report. She didn't understand the technical terms, but he pointed to the summary, explaining in whispers what each substance meant. Horror washed over Lucy's features, followed by a wave of protective fury that mirrored his own. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of anger. That woman," she said, her voice trembling with indignation, "doing that to a child, to little Theo. She's going to pay for it, Lucy. But I need you by my side. I need your strength," Arthur said. And for the first time, he wasn't speaking as a boss to an employee. He was speaking as one human being asking for help from another, an equal. In the early hours of the morning, they planned the final steps. The confrontation would happen the next evening, on Arthur's territory, his office. It would be a controlled environment where he would set the rules. Lucy would be present, not as a housekeeper, but as a witness, the moral pillar that would validate the accusation. The following day was the longest and most difficult of Arthur's life. He had to act with a torturous normality. He had to sit at the breakfast table and listen to Agatha report, with feigned concern, that Theo had had a miraculously peaceful night. "Perhaps the supplement is finally having a stronger effect," she said with a satisfied smile. Arthur felt the urge to flip the table, but he just nodded, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. He spent the day with Theo, a day that was both a rediscovery and a penance. He didn't take him to doctors or therapists. He took him to the garden. They sat on the grass, and for the first time in months, Arthur didn't talk about pain or treatments. He talked about stars, about the business that took him to faraway places, about memories of his mother, Theo, sensing the change, the genuine presence of his father, began to relax. He even laughed when Arthur tried to make a paper airplane and failed miserably. Every one of his son's laughs was a balm to Arthur's soul, and at the same time, a knife that deepened his rage against Agatha. The woman had stolen months of laughter, months of peace. It was a debt that could never be repaid. Night came. Arthur tucked Theo into bed, read him a story, and promised that, from that day on, the nighttime monsters would be gone for good. Then, he went downstairs. Lucy was already waiting for him near the office. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and said to her, "It's time." He pressed the intercom button and used the most neutral tone he could muster. "Agatha, could you please come to my office? I need to discuss something with you." He heard her affirmative reply, her voice calm and professional. The mask was still in place, but in a few minutes, it would fall, and the monster beneath would be revealed to the light. Agatha's footsteps on the marble hallway were firm and confident. They were the steps of a woman who believed she had absolute control of her domain. She knocked discreetly on the massive office door. "Come in," Arthur said, his voice sounding surprisingly calm. Agatha entered, her posture impeccable as always. Her gaze flickered from Arthur, seated behind his imposing mahogany desk, to Lucy, who stood quietly by the window. A frown of disapproval creased her brow. "Mr. Sterling, is something wrong?" she asked, her tone implying that the presence of a mere housekeeper in such an important meeting was, at best, inappropriate. "Yes, Agatha, something is," Arthur said, the calm in his voice, the stillness before a storm. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Please, have a seat." Agatha hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with Lucy's presence, but she complied. She sat on the edge of the chair, the personification of efficiency, ready to receive new orders. She expected a discussion about the household budget, perhaps a new plan for Theo's inheritance, or an adjustment to their domestic investments. The silence stretched for a few seconds, growing heavy, oppressive. Arthur watched her, studying the mask of devotion she wore so perfectly. He wondered how he could have been so blind, how his greed for an easy solution had led him to ignore all the signs. "I received some test results today," Arthur began, picking up the lab report that lay face down on his desk. Agatha's interest piqued. "Oh, from Dr. Evans. Did he finally find something?" "No," Arthur said, slowly turning the paper over and sliding it across the polished surface of the desk until it stopped directly in front of her. "These are from a different lab. An analysis of the vitamin supplement you prepare for Theo every night." The blood drained from Agatha's face. It was a subtle but unmistakable change. Her complexion went from a healthy tone to a pale, almost ashen white. Her eyes, once full of confidence, darted to the paper, reading the words that sealed her fate: phenolphthalein, senna extract. She didn't need to be a chemist to understand the mask of devotion didn't just fall, it shattered, revealing the terrified, furious monster hiding beneath. Her lips curled into a silent snarl. "This is absurd, a setup," she hissed, her voice losing its composure and gaining a sharp, venomous edge. "It was her, wasn't it?" Her eyes shot daggers at Lucy. "This ignorant housekeeper, filling your head with lies to steal my place. She wants your money, your fortune." Arthur remained silent, letting her drown in her own lies. He didn't need to scream or accuse. The report on the desk did all the work. "How could you?" he finally asked, his voice low but weighted with months of agony. "He's a child, my son. How did you have the heart?" Agatha's denial morphed into a raging desperation. "I dedicated my life to this house, to you, to that ungrateful child who never got better. You were always absent, building your businesses, counting your millions in crypto, while I was here, dealing with the screaming, the sleepless nights. I deserved more. I deserved security." It was a confession. The twisted motive, the greed and resentment laid bare under the desk lamp's glow. She didn't see Theo as a child, but as a tool, a means to an end. His illness was the cash flow that guaranteed the profitability of her position in the house. Lucy, who had remained silent, took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud, but it resonated with a moral authority that filled the room. "You didn't care for him. You hurt him. No amount of money, no net worth, justifies what you did to that boy's soul." The truth, spoken so simply, seemed to break Agatha's last thread of control. She shot to her feet, the chair toppling backward with a dull thud. Her eyes were wild, but before she could say or do anything else, Arthur pressed a button on his intercom. The office door opened, and two security guards, who had been waiting discreetly outside, stepped in. They weren't aggressive. Their movements were calm, professional, which made the scene all the more final, more inexorable. Agatha looked from Arthur to the guards, the realization that there was no escape finally dawning on her face. The game was over. Her power, built on the pain of a child, had crumbled to dust. Agatha's departure from the mansion was as quiet as her arrival years earlier. But the energy she left behind was entirely different. The oppressive presence, the rigidity that had permeated every corner of the house, dissipated like a morning fog. There were no screams, no scene, just the soft click of the door closing behind her and the security team who escorted her out, into the hands of the police who were already waiting discreetly at the property gate. Arthur didn't feel the triumph he had imagined. He felt a profound emptiness, a weariness that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. The battle was over, but the war for the recovery of his son and his own soul was just beginning. In the office, after Agatha was gone, a silence fell. Lucy came forward and, with a simple, motherly gesture, set Agatha's toppled chair upright. It was an act of restoration. the first of many that would be needed to heal that house. "It's over, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. Arthur looked at her. The woman who had come into his life to clean his flaws and ended up cleansing the wounds of his family. "Please, Lucy, call me Arthur." That night, for the first time in countless months, the mansion slept in peace. There were no screams, no crying, just the soft sound of a child's breathing, deep in sleep, free from the physical pain and psychological terror that had tormented him. Arthur spent the night in an armchair in Theo's room, just watching him sleep. Each peaceful breath his son took was like a dividend of peace being paid into his tormented soul. He saw how much he had lost, how much he had delegated. He had built an empire of assets, but had nearly allowed his emotional liabilities to bankrupt him. The healing, he realized, would not be instant. Theo's physical pain vanished as if by magic, but the scars on his trust and in his heart were deep. He startled at loud noises and was hesitant to trust any adult who wasn't his father or Lucy. It was she who guided the rebuilding process. In the weeks that followed, Lucy transformed the house. She filled the vacuum left by Agatha's sterile efficiency, not with orders, but with warmth. It started in the kitchen, a place that had been a laboratory for restrictive diets. With Arthur's permission, she began cooking simple, home-style meals. The same ones she made for her own son. The smell of carrot cake and fresh bread began to replace the scent of antiseptic, and she invited Theo to help. At first, he just watched from a distance, wary, but Lucy didn't push him. She just hummed quietly as she cracked eggs or sifted flour. Slowly, Theo drew closer. First, he dipped a finger in the cake batter. Then, he helped cut out cookies with a star-shaped cutter. And then, the first giggles started to bubble up. Genuine and crystal clear as he got flour on his nose. Arthur watched these interactions from afar, learning he, who commanded boardrooms, didn't know how to join in on kitchen play. It was Lucy who included him. "Arthur," she said one day, quite naturally, "Theo needs strong hands to knead this dough. Mine are tired." Awkwardly, he approached, took off his expensive jacket, and sank his hands into the sticky dough. Theo laughed, a loud, happy laugh, at the sight of his clumsy father. In that moment, covered in flour, the billionaire felt a connection and a joy that no successful stock market transaction had ever given him. The chasm between the millionaire and the housekeeper was dissolving, not over status or money, but through the universal language of care, food, and laughter. The house, once a place of pain and silence, was beginning to become a home. The wounds were still there, but now the sunlight could reach them, and they were slowly beginning to heal. The month following Agatha's departure was a period of quiet rediscovery. Arthur delegated the day-to-day management of his businesses to his most trusted deputies, a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to him months before. He realized that while he had been focused on increasing his net worth, the most important cash flow, that of love and time with his son, had been dangerously in the red. He traded board meetings for picnics in the garden and international conference calls for long talks with Theo about dinosaurs and distant galaxies. The transformation in Theo was remarkable. His sickly pallor gave way to a healthy glow in his cheeks. His eyes, once dull with fear, now shone with childish curiosity. He still had his moments of withdrawal, occasional nightmares that made him wake up calling for his father. But now, Arthur was there to hold him, to assure him the monsters were gone for good. Lucy's presence was the sun around which the new life of the house revolved. She was no longer just an employee. She had become the heart of the family. Arthur insisted on adjusting her salary and position, offering her the role of governess, but with a freedom and respect Agatha had never known. Lucy accepted with her usual grace, not for the promotion or the pay raise, but because she loved Theo and saw in Arthur a good man who had lost his way and was desperately trying to find his way back. One afternoon, as Arthur and Theo were assembling a complex jigsaw puzzle on the living room floor, Lucy came in with a tray of lemonade and cookies. She sat on the floor with them, helping Theo find a particularly tricky edge piece. In that moment, the scene was one of such perfect, natural domesticity that it hit Arthur with the force of a revelation. He wasn't just witnessing his son's healing, he was witnessing his own. He looked at Lucy, at the gentle smile on her face as she praised Theo for finding the right piece, at the light in her eyes that seemed to see right into his soul. He realized that the admiration and gratitude he felt for her had deepened, evolving into something warmer, more personal. It was a feeling that both scared and amazed him. That evening, after Theo had fallen asleep, Arthur found Lucy in the library, tidying some books. "Lucy," he began, his voice a little hesitant, "I can never thank you enough for what you've done for us." She turned key, a small smile on her lips. "You don't have to, Arthur. Seeing Theo smile is all the thanks I need." "It's more than that," he continued, taking a step closer. "You didn't just save Theo. You saved me. I was lost, drowning in my own fortune, and you threw me a life raft made of simplicity and kindness." The intensity in his gaze made Lucy's heart beat faster. There was a vulnerability there she had never seen, a raw honesty that brought down the last wall between the billionaire and the man. "You taught me that the greatest assets aren't listed on the stock exchange," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You taught me how to be present, how to listen, how to cook, how to be a father." He paused, searching for the right words to express what was in his heart, the biggest and riskiest investment of his life. "Lucy, I know our worlds are different. I have money, businesses, a complicated name, and you have wisdom. You have a heart that's worth more than all the gold in the world, and I think I'm falling in love with you." The confession hung in the air. As fragile and as powerful as Theo's first smile, Lucy looked at him, her eyes welling with tears, seeing not the multi-millionaire, but the man, the father, the human being who, like her, knew pain and joy, fear and hope. And in her silence, Arthur felt a panic that no stock market crash had ever caused him. Maybe he had misread everything. Maybe he had crossed a line and ruined the beautiful harmony they had built. The silence in the library stretched for a moment that felt like an eternity. For Arthur, it was an instant of total vulnerability, more exposed than in any business deal of his life. He had laid his heart on the table, an asset of incalculable value, with no guarantee of return. Lucy finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a simple step forward. She raised her hand and knocked with a tenderness that disarmed his last remnant of fear. She touched his cheek. "Arthur," she said, her voice a soft whisper, "the world of a father who loves his son and the world of a mother who loves hers are not so different. The rest is just details." In that touch, in that simple sentence, Arthur found his answer. It was not an explosive acceptance, but something much more profound, a recognition, an understanding that beyond the chasm of wealth and status, their souls spoke the same language. The final barrier between them dissolved, not in an overwhelming passion, but in a gentle, powerful current of respect, affection, and a deep human connection forged in the fire of adversity. In the days that followed, a new normal settled in, as natural as the morning sunlight. Their love was not a public declaration, but a series of small gestures. The way he now sought her gaze before making a decision about Theo. The way she would leave a coffee on his desk without being asked. The way they would tuck Theo in together, each reading a page of a story, their voices weaving together to create a tapestry of safety and love around the boy. The news about Agatha and her actions was handled with the utmost discretion. Arthur used his influence not to seek revenge, but to ensure justice was served quietly, protecting Theo from any media circus. Agatha was prosecuted, and the irrefutable evidence led to a conviction for abuse, ensuring she could never harm another child. The legal process was a chapter Arthur closed with the help of his lawyers. A final liability cleared from his books so he could focus on the assets that truly mattered. One of the most healing moments for Arthur was when he visited his late wife's grave. He went alone, carrying a bouquet of her favorite flowers. There, in the quiet of the cemetery, he spoke to her. He asked for forgiveness for his blindness, for allowing grief to distance him from their son. And then he told her about Lucy, not as a replacement, but as an unexpected angel who had saved them. He told her about Theo's laughter, about the smell of cake in the kitchen, and for the first time since her death, he felt not just the pain of loss, but also gratitude for the life that continued and for the second chance at happiness he had been given. The resolution for Theo came in an unexpected way. One evening, he was drawing in the living room while Arthur and Lucy talked quietly on the sofa. He walked over and held up his drawing. It was 3 stick figures, holding hands, under a big, smiling yellow sun. One figure was tall, another slightly shorter, and the third was small in the middle. He pointed to each one. Dad, Lucy, Theo. It was his definition of family, the acknowledgement that his world, once broken, was whole again, perhaps even stronger and brighter than before. Arthur and Lucy looked at each other over the boy's head, their eyes full of tears and a happiness so profound it was beyond words. All the major conflicts had found their resolution. The external threat was neutralized. Theo's internal pain was healing under the sun of love and security, and Arthur's conflict, his struggle against powerlessness and loneliness, had transformed into a journey of rediscovery and love. The mansion was no longer a cold, silent giant of steel and glass. It was a home, filled with the sound of laughter and the warmth of a family rebuilt from the ashes of pain. The years that followed were not a fairy tale of endless wealth or a life free of everyday problems. They were something far more real and, because of that, far more valuable. Arthur's fortune continued to exist, but its purpose changed. It ceased to be a scoreboard in a game of accumulation and became a tool to build a life of meaning. He drastically reduced his work hours, focusing on investments that had a positive social impact and allowed him to be home in the afternoons. He discovered that the return on a smile from Theo coming home from school was infinitely higher than any compounded interest from his hedge funds. The mansion, once a monument to his financial success, was transformed. Formal meeting rooms became playrooms, and walls that once displayed expensive abstract art now boasted Theo's colorful drawings. The most common sound in the hallways was no longer the echo of lonely footsteps, but of laughter and the barking of a rescue dog that Theo and Lucy had convinced Arthur to adopt. Lucy never tried to fit the mold of a billionaire's wife. She kept her simplicity, her earthy wisdom, and her kindness, which were, in Arthur's eyes, the most precious assets in his portfolio. She taught him to find joy in the small things, the taste of a tomato picked from the garden they planted out back, the beauty of a sunset from the porch, the comfort of a quiet evening reading side by side on the sofa. Together, they established a foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable children, using their capital not just to donate money, but to create systems of support and awareness, ensuring other families would not have to suffer what they had. Their experience had taught them that the true treasure was not the material inheritance they would leave behind, but the legacy of care and compassion. Theo grew into a well-adjusted, kind, and surprisingly humble young man. The shadow of his childhood trauma faded with time, becoming not an open wound, but a scar that reminded him of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love. He never took an interest in the stock market or his father's businesses, preferring to devote his time to music and volunteering at the foundation, a choice that filled Arthur with immense pride. The final scene of their journey didn't take place in a boardroom or at a gala. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, years later. Arthur, now with graying hair, watched from the porch. In the garden, Lucy was teaching Theo's teenage son, her grandson, how to plant sunflowers, the same flowers her own grandmother used to grow. The boy's laughter echoed in the air, mixing with the soft melody Theo was playing on his guitar, sitting on the grass. In that moment, Arthur Sterling, the man who once had a financial empire but was spiritually destitute, felt like the richest man in the world. His wealth was no longer in stocks, gold, or crypto. It was here, in the warmth of the sun on his face, in the sound of his grandson's laughter, in his son's music, and in the loving gaze of Lucy, the woman who came into his life to clean his floors and ended up showing him where true value lay. He finally understood that the greatest fortunes are not accumulated, but shared, and that love, in the end, is the only investment that always pays the highest dividends.